We're going to start the last panel of the day, which is moderated by SIPA's own Anya Schifrin, who is the head of the International Media Advocacy and Communications Specialization here at SIPA, and a journalist. And we have with us today from the World Bank Institute, Ihab Dia Abdu, who, as we heard earlier, is Ashoka fellow as well, and so in very good company with our earlier speaker, Imam Bibars, and a whole community of folks here today. Michael Hoffman, who came here from Barcelona and is working with Mondragon, the cooperative in the Basque region in Spain and now throughout the world, and will be talking to us about that. And then Antra Hadar is also here at Columbia. She's a postdoc researcher with the Committee on Global Thought. And then we have Fumi Tosu, who you all had the pleasure of tasting the food of the social enterprise that he is the co-president of, which is called Table for Two. He's also a recent grad from SIPA, Master in Development Practice program. So without further ado, welcome.
Okay, great. Everyone can hear me? Yeah. Well, our panel seems to be getting younger by the minute, which, and that was certainly the best conference lunch I've ever had at SIPA. Or I don't know about the rest of you. So thank you for that, Fumi. Yeah, I wanted to really just start with some very sort of practical questions. Earlier this week, we've had a few panel discussions on the situation in Egypt. And obviously one huge problem that, from the outside, it feels like the revolution is really in trouble, although our Egyptian speakers didn't feel that way. And I think one question that whenever we hear about Egypt and what's happening with the revolution, we think about the very high levels of unemployment there, both rural, youth, and urban. So the first thing I really wanted to start off with Ehab was tell us a little bit about your experience as a social entrepreneur in Egypt and how were you able to address some of those huge problems that the country faces.
Thanks a lot, Anya. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So the reason why I was selected as an Ashoka Fellow back in 2004 was because of Nahat al-Mahrousa, which means the Renaissance of Egypt, and it's an incubator for social enterprises. Basically, we've seen a huge need, a lot of young people who wanted to contribute to the country's development, but were not finding a way to contribute. And there were no political avenues for that, and not a lot of voluntary organizations. So a lot of these ideas were basically just either dying away or people were leaving the country constantly. We had a big brain drain to whether neighboring countries like Dubai and others or the West as well. So we set up this incubator basically trying to capture these ideas and telling people that come, at least you would have had the honor to have tried to do something for your country. And the amazing positive energy was overwhelming. So we've had a lot of great ideas, some of them related to employment. So we basically invite young people to come to us with their ideas and capture those, provide them with the necessary support, financially, giving them space basically so that they can work with others and so on, legal, accounting and so on, support. A couple of examples of the projects that helped that were recently spun off, for example, is the career development offices in Egyptian universities. We've basically a couple of young people coming to us. They've graduated. They found a good job in a multinational corporation, but came to us and said, "What about the thousands of young Egyptians who are graduating from universities and are sitting there not finding any kind of job? What about setting up something like a career development center like we have in any other reputable university in the world?" There were none. There were no career development centers in any Egyptian university, basically because of our socialist history. You would graduate, you would receive a letter of appointment from the government, you would sit and wait. So basically, they didn't set these up. So we helped these young people go and meet with the president of the university, find funding to set up this space. And now it's a self-sustainable model that is being replicated in other universities. And constantly you're getting a lot of ideas of civic engagement projects, of projects that are trying to respond to some issues related to tolerance and diversity, peace, education, employment, supporting of research and development and so on. Many of those people were actually finding ways to nominate them to Ashoka, because we basically take them from the beginning, try to take the risk with them and so on. And so we've learned a lot with that. We've learned that there are a lot of challenges, of course, that we are trying to work now to combat it, including laws and regulations and lack of finance.
Can you give us a couple of examples of success stories or businesses that were created with these new centers?
So these career development centers are in and of themselves success stories because they were basically none before they were created. So now we have one in Cairo University, which is the largest public university in the country, and it's being replicated. It's now already in 2 other universities, Ain Shams University and 6 other faculties within Cairo University. So now they are at the level of trying to scale up and so on. Another project that is being also spun off into a foundation is called the Young Innovators Awards. Again, also in Egyptian universities, several of the students came to us and said a lot of our graduation projects, they all that happens with them is that they are just become theoretical projects that are just put on the shelf to collect dust. How about we find ways to create a culture of research and development and innovation in the country by trying to fund some of these projects and link them up with businesses and stuff like that. So the project started with very minimal funding from some of these students. Now it's the largest research and development project in Egypt and the region, actually, with several million dollars from different multinationals and so on, covering Egypt's 19 public and private faculties of engineering and computer science, and supporting innovations and graduation projects and so on.
Like what kind of projects or innovations? Can you be really specific?
So mainly prototypes, for example. So a multinational would come to you, like Procter & Gamble, for example, and say, I want to improve my factory system and in some of the assembly lines, or some others that have to do with environment or the wastewater management, for example, and so on. So basically trying to put these ideas into practical
in already existing businesses.
Exactly, and link them up with the sector.
I see. And is the development marketplace at the World Bank going to do something similar, or what exactly will that project be about?
Okay, so based on our work at Nahat Mahrousa, I then worked with Brookings for a couple of years on a project called the Social Entrepreneurship in the Middle East. Basically trying to take a bird's eye view at the social entrepreneurship in the Middle East, working with Ashoka and with several other organizations, and trying to identify what the key challenges were. We've identified 3 key challenges, or maybe also that could be turned to opportunities for social entrepreneurship in the region. One was the lack of supportive legal and regulatory frameworks, whether they're NGO laws, whether they're the lack of any hybrid models in the region, or impact investment laws that support impact investment. The second was around issues related to the lack of intermediaries. Ashoka remains one of the very few intermediaries that supports and incubates social enterprises. A couple others exist, but the lack of angel investment or scale-up investment and so on. And the third had to do a bit more with culture, because a lot of the issues also relate to maybe it's an evolutionary process, but a lot of times, whether your business community or your philanthropy, they remain 2 separate sectors. So this convergence of social entrepreneurship in the middle is happening, but very slowly. So also had to do with the role of media and culture and stuff like that. Based on that, the development marketplace and came to being as an idea after the Arab Spring. The World Bank Institute started saying, how can we respond to this new energy and so on, taking into consideration these 3 key challenges, how we can support them. So we're looking at Egypt as a pilot country, then hoping to roll out into the rest of the Middle East and North Africa countries, focusing on the agricultural supply chain.
Like what kinds of things are you planning to do in agricultural supply? Do you know yet?
We are looking at, it will be a national competition whereby we'll be providing financial and technical support to the finalists and the winners. And we're looking at 2 main sectors. One is handicrafts, to ensure that we're including gender and including women. And the other would be related to food processing or agricultural waste management, supporting basically social enterprises, basically financially viable entities that need the support, but that also have a social impact. So you're not only creating jobs, but you're also having a social impact and providing for the poor.
I see. So basically giving money and help to young businesses that need to scale up.
Yes.
Yeah. And in handicrafts, when I've been in Egypt, I've seen a lot of handicrafts made in China, actually.
Yes.
So are you trying then to foster innovative designs or help spread distribution, or what are you going to do in terms of handicrafts?
That's a wonderful point, because it touches very much also a very something very close to my heart. In another life or in my evenings, I spend my evenings working on something called I'm Egyptian, or Ana Masri, which is a foundation that tries to promote the pride and understanding of our common heritage as Egyptians. We have one of the most fascinating civilizations in the world, 7,000 or maybe more years, but we are not in touch with that. Every, I would believe, colonizer or invader that came wiped out something, and what remains of that link is very small. So we're trying to revive that and so on. So that would be part of it, but also digging deeper and looking at some of the wonderful handicrafts that we still have maintained and trying to provide them support so that they can compete with these mass produced and much cheaper products that are coming from China. And it's true, you go to Khan Khalili, the bazaar in Cairo, and most of the Nefertiti and Tutankhamun, they're all made in China or Taiwan, which is very...
That's right, and you see the same quote-unquote handicrafts throughout the Middle East. They're not actually made locally. Antra, this whole question of sort of vertical supply chains and agriculture makes me think a little bit about my different visits to Bangladesh and the way that microfinance, microcredit has really blossomed, or had blossomed until all the recent scandals, from a few women sitting around lending each other money every month to that those very ambitious plans for cell phones and chicken feed and chickens. And you've obviously studied the sector for probably something like 10 years, so you've seen it go through its iterations. Can you talk to us a little bit about the difference between the sort of first and second generation and what worked and what didn't?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that everyone's tired and there's been a lot of microcredit and microfinance talk already, but I'm going to take the slightly scenic route to answering this question. Because I think that the narrative sort of leads into the answer to the question. And so what I'm going to do is very quickly try and trace the evolution of microfinance as I see it from inception to crisis. So I think the microfinance experience can be divided broadly into 3 generations. So there was the era from the mid-70s approximately to the late 80s. And in this period, it started with Yunus and sort of Grameen and Fazl Abed and Brak carrying out these very, very localized experiments in the villages of Bangladesh. And in this era, microfinance was genuinely homegrown, deeply rooted, and highly responsive as an institution. It developed the model, which we all know, lending to women so that they could invest in productive assets in the hope that these assets would yield profits and have a poverty alleviating effect. And it was a genuine social innovation in that it departed not only from the conventional banks in not requiring collateral or having formal contracts, but it departed also from many, many government lending schemes that predated it in the subcontinent, where the loan was treated essentially as a handout. So microfinance insisted on repayment, and I think this was crucially important in what it was able to do, and it was able to sustain repayment rates consistently above 90% for several decades of its operation. And we'll talk in a minute about why this was possible, but a large part of the answer lies in the group mechanism. So the women, the borrowers, and again, we all know this, but the borrowers were divided into groups of 4 or 5, and the group acted as both the social unit of the institution and the unit that dealt with sort of loan disbursement and collection. And in this era, it's important to note that there was minimal government regulation, as in the Grameen Bank had a legislation, but there wasn't any regulation of the sector per se. Okay, so then we get to second generation microfinance, which is, I think, roughly from the late 80s to as late as 2006. And in this era, the sort of distinguishing feature is that microfinance goes beyond the borders of Bangladesh. It becomes a global phenomenon. So it acquires replicas in over 100 countries. It gets huge amounts of media attention. It gets huge amounts of academic attention with not altogether positive results, as I'll talk about in a minute. And of course, endorsement from international organizations and so on and so forth. But what emerges in this era of the microfinance experiment is the idea of joint liability, which is a term coined by the sort of economics community. And this is so economics essentially reduces microfinance to to this concept of joint liability, and they explain its success in terms of the fact that theoretically loans were given to one member of the group, and the other members of the group couldn't get loans until the first one repaid, so there was a lot of pressure on the borrower to repay. Now, this is hugely, hugely problematic, and I think it's hugely underestimated how pernicious this concept ended up being. And it's problematic for three different reasons. To begin with, every single practitioner of microfinance that I've spoken to in Bangladesh has told me, and this is without exception, the joint liability in the strict sense never ever operated on the ground. It was absolutely a construct of the theoretical and particularly the economics community. Second, explicitly, Bangladesh had moved on from the joint liability model by this time. People were not paying back because other group members couldn't get loans until they paid back. They were paying back because it appealed to their individual economic rationality, and by that point it had become a habit for the established group members to pay back. The third, and to me the most interesting problem with the joint liability paradigm is its institutional implications. The moment you reduce something as complex as microfinance to a kind of cookie-cutter flattened model, it completely trivializes the problem of replication. It's just, it's a completely reductive approach, and you should be able, on the economic view, to be able to replicate it without any problem at all. Okay. Now, I think this bleeds directly into the current era of microfinance, which is, I think, 2006 to the present, which is the era of crisis. And this era is characterized by the attempt at essentially scaling up or universalizing microfinance. And I think this is a topic that is of interest to many people in the room. And this essentially scaling up in the case of microfinance took three forms. The first is that it was an era of irrational exuberance in the sector. There were more and more microfinance providers entering the fray. There was a huge proliferation. What this meant is that there was a huge oversupply of credit in certain areas, so borrowers could take loans from more than one MFI. And what they started to do was take loans from one MFI to pay back loans from another. And this led to the phenomenon of overlapping and borrowers getting caught in a debt trap. The second is that in this era, there was an attempt made to sort of mass manufacture microfinance. There was an attempt, and it's been so successful for so long, why can't we turn it into this sort of universalized assembly line kind of thing? And the logic of this derives very much from the economic view that I was talking about a minute ago. And the third major development was the shift from non-profit or not-for-profit lending to for-profit lending. And some MFIs sort of couched this in the narrative of expansion and scaling up, and others just saw it as an opportunity to make money in an untapped sector. And at the forefront of all of this was SKS Microfinance, rated until recently as the second most important MFI in the world after Grameen, operating in Andhra Pradesh in India. Its explicit goal was to develop the Coca-Cola or McDonald's version of microfinance, as it called it. And in early 2010, it issued an IPO, raising $350 million for the sector. But very soon after, in November of 2010, it plunged into one of the biggest crises in microfinance history. And so I think, this evolution is, it really brings a cautionary tale to bear on the other discussions about social innovation that we're having. And I think that the crisis is really the product of two things. The fundamental misinterpretation of microfinance as an economic rather than a social venture. And the second are its the institutional implications of that misinterpretation, and attempting to short-circuit what is an evolutionary institutional process and get immediately to the end point.
So what do you think will happen next? Will microfinance be able to recover from all of this?
I think that, it's very, very difficult to say. It's, the crisis is profound. It has, it's confined, it's huge in India, but it's confined not only to India, it's spread to other parts of the subcontinent. Microfinance in Bangladesh is in crisis as well, the most dramatic illustration of this being Yunus's removal as the head of the Grameen Bank. But there are problems in Latin America and Nicaragua, in Nicaragua in particular, in African microfinance in Nigeria, so on and so forth. And I think what has been hit hardest is the sort of trust and faith in the institution itself. And this was really the key thing. It was trust and social capital that sustained the system, both in terms of the social capital between the group, within the group, between the bank and borrowers, and most of all in this institution itself. So in terms of the future for microfinance, I think that it will take a while to recover. I think it might be able to sort of recover, but it'll need to do a lot to reinstate faith in the institution itself. And I think the major shift that will have happened in the light of this crisis is that it was a bit of an institutional marvel operating at the scale at which it was. I mean, over 50 million borrowers worldwide without formal regulation. But I think regulation now is inevitable.
Thank you for that. Michael, when we think of cooperatives, it's hard to imagine. We think of sort of an age-old traditional form of managing a firm. It's hard to think of how a cooperative is a social innovation. Can you tell us a little bit how Mondragon works and why it's a social innovation?
Thank you, Anya.
Thank you.
I think in order to understand the link between a cooperative and social innovation, it's important in the case of Mondragon to understand its history. Basically, Mondragon started up in 1956. It was created by a priest in a northern province of Spain, in the Basque Country. And the priest basically arrived at that particular town called Mondragon, back then a very small town with 7,000 people. And he arrived back in 1941, about 2 years after the Spanish Civil War ended. So basically the circumstances were really bad. Back then it was really a lot of poverty. The social context was very bad. And basically this priest had a vision. He wanted to create a organizational model that is based on participation and on solidarity. So he started up a technical college. He realized that the local conditions were very bad in terms of the labor conditions. So workers basically didn't have many rights. Workers were refused education, and this is basically where he started. He started off a technical college, provided education on a local level, trained up the people, and trained them to set up their own companies. So this is where everything started, basically. In 1956 then, the first kind of spin-off of this technical college came into existence. And ever since, this very small technical college has created Mondragon Corporation, which is now the largest industrial cooperative in the world with 83,000 people in 20 countries. And the impact that it has made is largely based on the main product of Mondragon Corporation, and that is employment and personal development. So in contrast to basically normal for-profit organizational structures that are based on profit maximization, the main product of Mondragon is employment. So we want to generate employment, and we want to maintain that employment. Mondragon Corporation is basically active in 4 main areas. The biggest one is the industrial area, basically. So in comparison to other types of cooperatives, in India, for instance, sugarcane cooperatives, which is a producer cooperative, Mondragon is a workers cooperative. And as such, it competes with a lot of other non-cooperatives in the industrial sector. So Mondragon has 2 main sectors, one being the industrial sector and the other one being the retail sector. So for instance, we've got a lot of businesses in car manufacturing, basically providing parts to car manufacturers, a lot of kind of capital goods, a lot of consumer goods. At the same time, we have the second biggest supermarket chain in Spain called Eroski. And these 2 kind of sectors create the backbone of Mondragon. 95% of all employees work in these 2 sectors. The other 2 sectors include knowledge and services. So knowledge being Mondragon, we've got our own university. We've got 14 research centers across the world. And this concept of innovation that is basically part and parcel of Mondragon is very, very important for the future. Because 80% of all employees work in Spain. Only 20% of the 83,000 people are basically based abroad. And the Spanish economy has been hit very, very badly by the economic crisis. In Spain, for instance, Spain has got an unemployment rate of sub-25-year-olds of 50%. That's just crazy. So the future of the Spanish market is up in the air. No one knows whether Spain is going to recover, whether Spain is going to become the next Greece. So basically, this has huge implications for Mondragon because Mondragon needs to go international. Mondragon needs to innovate. Mondragon needs to go into sectors where it hasn't been. So this concept of innovation is part of every single of the 255 individual cooperatives that make up Mondragon. So every year there's innovation projects. People get selected, ideas get collected. There's a lot of committees, evaluation committees, that basically evaluate to what extent the innovative idea could actually come to the market. And this is how spin-off companies are generated. So this is how, from this one technical college, through this innovation idea, all the other 255 organizations have basically been generated. And just to come back to the social innovation, the implications, most of all in the Basque Country, are that this concept of education, of labor rights, and the concept of solidarity. So to give you an example, there's a wage solidarity in Mondragon. It depends on, it varies from cooperative to cooperative. So for instance, in the cooperative I work, there's a ratio of 1:6, which means the lowest paid person, the difference between the lowest paid person and the highest paid person is 1:6. So that basically means that our CEO is probably one of the lowest paid CEOs in Europe, but it really creates this solidarity kind of spirit in the company. So and this is really an important part of Mondragon as well.
I wonder if the solidarity contributes to the innovation, right? If people must feel presumably much more invested in where they're working if they belong to it. And I'm wondering also if you can give us any examples of the innovation and the spin-offs that you're talking about. What kinds of things have been developed?
So specific examples of innovation projects are, for instance, the health sector. So Mondragon Health has been created about 5 years back. There have been old people's homes have been basically set up, and various initiatives in this health sector have basically been started. Another sector that Mondragon has gone into is basically an environmental sector. So climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation. So mitigation being everything that reduces emissions, energy efficiency, which makes perfect sense given that Mondragon has got a huge production facility base, basically. So there's a lot of potential to improve energy efficiency in all of these production facilities. What else? It's just so much going on. It's really difficult to keep track, to be honest.
Are the old age homes for former employees or retired employees of Mondragon?
No.
They're for people outside. Yeah. I'm just wondering if that sense, I mean, that's what people say about Scandinavia, right? There's more innovation there because there's this strong social safety net and the feeling that people will be taken care of and that it's safe to fail, right? You won't be out on the street as you would be in this country. Do you think that's true in Mondragon or not?
Well, the concept of ownership by the employees, which basically means that it's not some kind of stockholder that owns the corporation, but it's every single employee that is basically a stakeholder of the corporation. This has positive and negative sides. The negative side is that it creates even though it creates job security, because if one of the cooperative goes bust, then all the employees basically get reallocated to different parts of Mondragon Corporation. On the other hand, that creates some kind of a civil servant mentality to some extent, because everyone basically knows, well, you know, if my cooperative goes bust, then I'll just go to a different one. And especially given that the Spanish economy has been hit so badly, and especially given that so far 80% of all employees are based in Spain, the need and the drive to go international is a big challenge in terms of language skills, in terms of mentality, in terms of having the network in countries where we basically are trying to generate business. So it's a very challenging time for Mondragon. However, given that the organizational model is a very well thought out one, and is one that is based on a triple bottom line approach, it's a very sustainable one. In terms of innovation, this means that even though the ideas that go through all these committees that are generated as part of these innovation projects, they are usually of high quality, but they take a long time. So usually an innovation project takes about a year, and then it gets reviewed by several committees. So sometimes by the time the product or the business idea is ready, it's already too late. So this is one of the key challenges that, for instance, as part of this innovation process, that Mondragon is trying to improve on.
Thank you very much. Fumi, is Table for Two trying to innovate, or are you sticking to a sort of tried and true model that's worked over the last few years? And maybe you want to tell us a little bit about what that model is.
Sure. So first, I think a number of you have heard this pitch multiple times, so I apologize. But for the rest of you, Table for Two, the organization I work for, here's the basic concept. So we consume too much here in the US, right? Can anyone guess how many calories the average American eats in a day? 3,000. I heard 3,000, I heard 2,000, 4,000. It's closer, the latest figures I've seen are somewhere in the ballpark of 3,900 to 4,000, which is more than 1.5 times the recommended caloric intake. And the concept is, you know, what if we are able to take some of those excess calories that we don't need here and transfer them to countries that need the calories? And that way you can solve, or help to solve, two opposing problems of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and other issues related to overconsumption here, and malnutrition and hunger as a result of an inadequate amount of food and nutrition. And the way we do this is we partner with corporate cafeterias, restaurants, and university dining halls, including the cafe on the 6th floor of SIPA, where we designate a healthy, well-balanced, slightly low-calorie Table for Two branded meal. We monetize the amount of the reduced calories, and 25 cents per meal is donated to us, and it goes to a school feeding program in 6 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So, you know, by eating one Table for Two meal, you benefit from the healthy meal, and you also give a meal.
How many calories were in our lunch?
So I actually texted, we work with a catering company that provided the bentos, and this is just one of many of our Table for Two meals. I texted him, he didn't respond, but I think it's around 750 to 800. It depends, there's chicken, fish, and veggie. I think a veggie is the lowest, but it's somewhere in that range.
That's great. And is this model working perfectly, or are you planning to innovate it, or was it already such an innovation?
What I didn't discuss is this model was founded in Japan 5 years ago, and it's been a very big success. It's probably the most visible nonprofit in Japan right now, but outside of Japan, no one has heard about it. And I met the founder a couple of years ago, and he was thinking about expanding abroad, and a couple of friends and I decided to launch the program here in the US. And now it's in 13 countries on, I guess, this side of the imaginary table, and it's expanding fast, but we're also going through some growing pains, and each market is very different, so we have different challenges here versus what they faced in Japan.
Can you talk a little bit about how the challenges are different here than in Japan, and also who you're partnering with in this country?
Sure. So the challenge in Japan, the nonprofit sector in Japan is severely underdeveloped. When you hear the word nonprofit, people think about people volunteering their time and not getting paid at all, and going around soliciting donations, not knowing where the money is going. And so from what I hear from the founder in Japan, is the biggest challenge there was just to, the non-profits weren't accepted as much, and so that was the bigger challenge. Whereas here, there are too many nonprofits and too many charities. So we have, when we talk to a corporation about our model, it's great, but they say, why this versus the 20 other charities that are talking to us? And so it's almost a polar opposite in terms of challenges.
And I had asked, who are some of the American partners that we might have heard of?
Our first corporate partner was AIG, but we don't discriminate. We provide healthy meals, and we
even to capitalists, not just school children.
And we're talking to a few banks in Wall Street right now as well. But we provide healthy meals, and we provide an opportunity for employees, customers at a restaurant, university students to contribute to their health, but also contribute to a cause within their daily lives. And so AIG was our first corporate partner, and right now we're talking to a large tobacco producer. There are also other less controversial partners. Colombia started in October. We're at, I think, 6 academic institutions with 3 more starting in the next 2 weeks. And we're at about 15 or so restaurants in New York, DC, and San Francisco.
Okay. Congratulations. Professor Menard, Sarah took the organizer's prerogative of sending me her question last night. So I'll start with that. And you can correct me if I get your question wrong. One of the questions Sarah had was if you could elaborate a little bit about how your organizations collaborate with other sectors and other partners, public, private, social sector, community collaboration, and how this supports or drives your social innovation, and any obstacles there too. Did I get that right? It was a long question. So, and that's for anybody who wants it.
I guess I'll just start very briefly. Table for Two globally, but in particular in the US, is very small. I'm the only full-time paid employee in the US. And so we need to collaborate, and we need partnerships. And so obviously the corporations, universities that have cafeterias, but also Ashoka U has a network of universities. We're also working with Net Impact. We can't scale by going university by university or corporation by corporation, so we have to utilize these existing networks. And so for us, it's all about partnerships. We also partner with the World Economic Forum for their corporate contacts. Yeah.
Do you have to work with a lot of governments in the countries where you make the donations? In the school feeding programs, or?
No, we work with, so our money goes to, we don't operate the school meal programs ourselves. We work with 3 NGOs that work on the ground that operate these meal programs, and we don't work with the government on that.
Are these in Africa, or?
Yes, they are. They're all in Africa.
Got it. So you're just giving money to an NGO in those countries. Was it Uganda? Remind me which countries?
It's Uganda, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Kenya, and South Africa.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry, did I cut you off, Michael? Were you about to answer the? Carry on.
In the case of Mondragon, at the end of the day, Mondragon is, even though it's a different organization model, it's still a business. So companies need to make a small profit, otherwise they go out of business. That's what it is. So as such, we work with all different sectors. We work for governments, we work with NGOs, and given the development focus here, Mondragon, for instance, has its own NGO called Monukide, which works in 4 countries, in Mozambique, in Cuba, in Brazil, and in Peru. And what they do is mostly providing SME development assistance. So in Cuba, for instance, it's in the sugarcane industry. In Africa, it's mostly in the agricultural sector. And it's pretty much something like a SME toolkit kind of support. So anything related from business plan development to how to access finance, marketing, anything for SMEs basically. So this is one aspect I'm very proud of, to be honest.
Great. Did anyone else want to?
Yeah. So with the Nahat al-Mahrousa in Cairo, we work with a lot of other NGOs, other local Egyptian NGOs, as well as we remain dependent a lot on funding of other organizations. So we work a lot with. There has been a big increase in local philanthropy and corporate social responsibility programs before the revolution in Egypt. The corporate sector was growing and hence started to have more of a role. So we work with several local foundations and local corporate social responsibility programs, the International Youth Foundation, USAID, and other programs. And for the development marketplace, because the World Bank gets a very mixed image in Egypt, of course, having been supportive of the old regime, we were very keen on finding local partners. So we're very happy to have identified a co-financer, a co-funding from a local family foundation, and we're trying to reach out to other family foundations just to make sure that to position this as a program that is not just parachuted from the World Bank, but that is also responding to the need and working with local ownership and local partners.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to this very quickly. I should clarify a point of identification first. I come at the social innovation question slightly differently from the other panelists in that I'm not an active practitioner, but a keen observer. I think that the relationship between microfinance and both the public sector and the private sector is interesting, so I just wanted to sort of throw that into the mix. As far as the private sector goes, most of the big MFIs, particularly in Bangladesh, have gone into various kinds of social enterprises, ranging from Grameen phone to electricity generation to education, to most recently yogurt manufacturing, production, Grameen Veolia, which does water. BRAC has a whole range of social enterprises. My sense is that they've not been terribly successful. It's particular. I mean, they've not sort of. Most of them have not managed to break even. And part of the story may be that they're relatively young, and what they were doing really was piggyback riding on the goodwill of the sector more generally. So the fact that that's nosedived, I think, doesn't help the incubation period or gestation period for the private sector collaborations. As far as the public sector goes, the Bangladeshi government's greatest contribution to the NGO sector and microfinance in particular in Bangladesh until recently was letting it exist and not interfering. And when that stopped happening, I mean, there's quite an interesting backstory there. Sheikh Hasina, who's the current prime minister, was very supportive of microfinance until about 5 years ago when Yunus and Abid tried to form a political party. And she felt that her toes were being stepped on. And it's a sort of an open secret that this is the real reason why Yunus is no longer the MD of Grameen Bank. So, I mean, the tide has really turned here. I mean, it's a bit of a mystery in development circles why the Bangladeshi government allowed the NGO sector and microfinance the space that it did. Part of the explanation is that it was sort of substituting for the job that the government should have been doing in the first place. But it's a very fraught relationship between microfinance and the government. And the tide has turned dramatically in that there is more and more government regulation now in the very recent past.
That's really, the Bangladeshi government hasn't been very supportive at all, right? I was just wondering with our other panelists, is there any role at all for government to play? Is there anything they should be doing or not doing, or are they just sort of irrelevant to the different kinds of things that you work on? Cooperative, small businesses.
have a very strong opinion.
Okay. Then we like strong opinions, especially 5:45 after a long day.
As we always say in the Egyptian civil society, and I think across the region, is that the best thing government can do is just stay away if they can. But unfortunately, they can't, and they keep interfering. And I don't think we're seeing that changing even after the revolution. We have one of the most restrictive, if not the one of the most restrictive across the globe NGO laws in Egypt. That is just compared to an NGO law in some Central Asian countries that are among the most restrictive to civil society. So basically, we do work with the government on some specific ministries, like the Ministry of Higher Education when it comes to universities and so on. But when it comes to our main counterpart, the Ministry of Social Solidarity or others, it's always been a very tough situation. And now we're just talking to Iman during the break about the NGO law that is being now reviewed, which is even more restrictive in a lot of ways after the revolution. So there are a lot of NGO coalitions that are going and trying to propose that this not be ratified. So
yeah, I mean, one of our speakers earlier this week was saying that actually since the revolution, there's more power concentrated in the hands of the military than before, because so many of those other power bases in the country have now been wiped out. So they weren't very optimistic, right?
yeah.
That's easy. Sure.
Yeah, because we spoke a lot about that earlier with Iman, so I feel like one doesn't want to sound very negative, but it's actually it's quite a bit of a worrying situation where you don't know, like it's between the SCAF, the military, and the Islamists dominating the parliament, and some very ultra-Orthodox seats being given to about 25% of the most ultra-Orthodox right-wing groups. So it's you don't know which one to fear more or to worry about more, where people who started the revolution are basically feeling that the revolution has been hijacked by the young and the secular and so on. So yeah.
Yeah, it reminded me so much of what happened here after Obama's election. We had so many enthusiastic young people, especially at SIPA, and then then we all sort of woke up and realized, oh my God, there are a lot of those people out there outside of the Upper West Side are actually Tea Party members. And when I was in Egypt, it reminded me so much of that feeling, right? People created this revolution and thought they were bringing about change, and realized they didn't have necessarily mass support around the country. Did any of the panelists want to comment on each other before I bring in the audience? Yes,
I actually
please.
have a quick question for Fumi. Just to clarify what the model is it that the buyer in the developed world pays exactly the same, but it's just a smaller meal, and you use the savings to fund the sort of meal provision in Africa? Is that?
Yeah, that's the concept.
Okay.
So the concept is you take an existing meal that's too big, basically. You make it marginally smaller, and then that is a donation. But that adds another step for corporations or restaurants, and some of them, that prevents them from participating. And so what we end up doing with more than half of our partners is we take an existing meal, healthy meal, and add 25 cents and try to promote that meal over the less healthy alternatives.
So why are they? To me, it seems like one of the huge sort of comparative advantages to your scheme is that when you buy sort of fair trade products, most sort of products of this kind are a bit more expensive. So if you're being able to sort of match the price and throw in a health benefit, why are they averse to the first version of?
Oh no, the consumers aren't averse to it. It's more just it's an added hurdle that whoever it is that's serving the food has to jump over.
I mean, I think the food industry in America, correct me if I'm wrong, in the last 20 years has been all about giving more cheaper food, right?
So they don't actually
worse
save
quality,
that much.
but more of it. I've read that David Kessler book where there's all this filler on our plates now, right? All those French fries and things that you don't need, and they're really cheap, but they make the plate look bigger. So you're sort of doing a much more Japanese minimalist.
I guess so. And I mean,
yeah, that's right.
we're also simplifying the issue. It's not just that we're consuming too many calories; it's that we're consuming, the wrong calories. And people who suffer from obesity aren't necessarily those that eat too much, and so we simplify the issue a lot. But I think that's also a strength of what Table for Two does.
That's great. Was your question answered, Antra?
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. For the moment,
Oh.
okay. we can always come
Yes.
back to your.
Can I add something about, or not?
Of course.
In
Yes.
terms of government involvement, I was
Yeah,
going to
please.
just, we don't work directly with the government on this side in the developed world, aside from within their cafeterias. But one interesting development, and the environment in Egypt is very different from Japan and the U.S. But Table for Two, it took a couple years for them to really expand in Japan. And if you look at the graph, you see a slow increase, and then it really shoots up. And what happened there was the government instituted a new law, and it's a very interesting law, basically penalizing and fining companies that have a certain percentage of their employees over a certain waistline, which would probably never fly in the U.S. But and if you look at the graph, the law is instituted, and then Table for Two really takes off because companies need to figure out ways to basically, make their employees lose weight.
That's great. Thank you.
So if something like that happened in the U.S.,
That's a
we'd
great
be a lot more successful.
The sort of Mondragon, I can just see changing salaries based on weight, the 6-to-1 ratio. I see a lot of innovative possibilities here. It looks like you had a.
Yes,
something
I had a
comment
question
or
to Michael, because we keep in looking at whether at the development marketplace or other programs, when we look at the legal framework of what options a social enterprise has, most of the social enterprises we have in the region struggle between either being a company, and this takes away a lot of their access to grants and whatever, or an NGO, and then you can't be responsive to market forces and so on. Then you can't really be trading and so on. One other option that remains unused, unfortunately, because of the stigma that comes with it, and because of the perception that there's government intervention and it's a socialist, communist idea and so on, are cooperatives, unfortunately, in Egypt, and I guess maybe other parts of the world, but Egypt and Lebanon and several other countries that we've been looking at least in the Middle East. Is this an issue that you struggle with in Spain, or has this been part of the evolution of the cooperative movement, that there were some stigmas and so on, or has this not been an issue at all? And if yes, how did you?
Well, a pretty striking example of that, for instance, would be whenever we're trying to work with like very kind of capitalist kind of market players, then we kind of get perceived as, we're not real business partners, because we're a cooperative, you're not real business partners. So sometimes we actually face that kind of perception. But as I mentioned before, at the end of the day, even though the organization structure is different, we are just, we're just a business that is part of the private sector as well, then in that case. So, yeah.
Anybody out there have a question?
My prerogative as the
good.
faculty again for this last one, and then I promise I will rotate that way around the room. One thing, thanks all so much, because it's so fascinating how you all literally represent, the models that I teach my students. I mean, this is the variation right here. And so it's fascinating to see. And I guess the one big question for me when we talk about harnessing markets for social change, so those two things, the idea of values and ethics, and then what happens to values and ethics as they get operationalized, as they become mission, right? So I would love for each of you to talk about how the values in the model work, get challenged once they're faced with the concept of harnessing markets. Is that clear? Should I repeat? I'm not sure I'm clear, actually. So how does this concept of mission drift, right? Happens a lot with the microfinance. It happens a lot with cooperatives, happens a lot with social enterprises. And of course, it happens a lot in the development industry, because we have, partnerships with intended outcomes, and then the metrics change or the politics change, and the intervention then changes. So how do we do this better? How do we keep mission? And is it really that critical? Maybe mission drift is part of social innovation, part of creative disruption. I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit, because it's really what we're grappling with the social before innovation. This idea that there are values and ethics embedded in the work that we're doing as innovators, as entrepreneurs. But what are the challenges in harnessing markets, the competitive supply-demand nature inherent in all markets, that calls into question that commitment to values, and how have these models maybe navigated that?
Microfinance is all about mission drift, so I think clearly you better start on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a really excellent question, and something that I think about a lot, and that I've been forced to think about a lot in studying microfinance. And I think the first, where did Sarah go? Right. Oh, so I think what really sprang to mind as you were asking that question is the very brief discussion we were having earlier today about social innovation, potentially not just as action but as ideas as well. And I think what the distillate of my study of microfinance indicates to me that the main reason driving the mission drift of microfinance was, as I said, the representation of it fundamentally in economic rather than social terms. Microfinance attracted a lot of attention, and the bulk of that attention was channeled towards its economic impacts, that it would alleviate poverty, with Yunus saying that it would put poverty in museums in our lifetimes, on the economic transformations that it would bring about. And this was being done by both commentators and active practitioners of microfinance. But to some of us who've been studying it for a while, it was clear that it was not going to be able to alleviate poverty single-handed. The loan sizes were too small, interest rates were too high, and it was not a program geared towards that kind of structural transformation. And when I say this, I don't mean to underrate microfinance. I think it had a tremendous legacy. It just was that it wasn't in the economic domain, it was in the social domain. It had hugely empowering effects on women and various other people, particularly women in many parts of the developing world. It took women who'd never been outside of their huts or fields before and gave them the discipline and the confidence to take loans, start businesses, and be disciplined enough to pay them back. It hugely augmented levels of trust and social capital in the areas in which it operated, and it changed the norm systems of participants in the program. So the question really is, why was it being misinterpreted or misrepresented, even by the people who were sort of central to the program? And here I think that there's a sort of hegemonic element of how we evaluate, and the metrics in which even social innovators feel the need to justify themselves. And they need to justify it in terms of these very, very sort of simplistic bottom lines, repayment rates, growth rates. And so really, I think that the way to avoid mission drift, and is to particularly in this very sort of fraught marriage between markets and social innovation, is to start to rethink the paradigms in a very fundamental way. I was interested to hear you say that Mondragon, you mentioned a triple bottom line. I'm not sure about what the third is, but that employment is one of the major metrics that it sort of evaluates its success by. And so I think we need more and more sort of ambitious ways of valuing the intangible, or what is intangible, because economics hasn't figured out the algebra yet.
Good, yeah. Anybody?
Okay. I think in the case of Mondragon, it's going to be a very interesting journey. I basically joined Mondragon 2 years back, and a lot of my coworkers have been part of Mondragon for their entire lives, basically. So I wouldn't say they're set in their own ways, but there's established ways of working, there's established ways of approaching things, despite all the innovation. And wanting to enter new markets that would basically expose us to competition that our business model would struggle with, makes the whole thing really difficult. So one key objective of Mondragon is to also nurture the inter-cooperative cooperation. So the first thing that a person within Mondragon, when they're looking for partners, would do is, okay, within Mondragon, do we have a cooperative that does something that we're looking for? However, if you want to go international, if you want to enter new markets, then you should stay very open. You should try to collaborate with market leaders that are not necessarily part of Mondragon, obviously. So there's been a bit of a culture clash as well. So I've had quite a few interesting discussions with people within Mondragon about how we should approach strategic issues, how we should go about forming collaborations with other market leaders, and why it's important to try to act quickly.
I think on a much smaller scale, we're also expanding internationally, and we're facing, I guess, challenges to our basic mission. And for example, in the U.S., a lot of small restaurants, it's a pain really to recreate their menus with the Table for Two logo, collect the donations if their registers aren't electronic. And so some restaurants came up to us and said, we love your model and your mission. Can we just donate $50 a month or $100 a month? So that would be one example. Another example is the various countries. For example, in Japan, even though Table for Two's mission is to solve this global food imbalance, the focus is really on sub-Saharan Africa and malnutrition. And in the U.S., we're really trying to push the other side of the table. And as we discuss these challenges, I think one thing, there are certain parts of our mission that we can't sort of compromise on, and there are other parts that we can. And actually, another example along the same lines as the restaurants is we're launching a vending machine program next month. And basically, it's a healthy vending machine. All the products are healthy, Table for Two branded, and a percentage of the revenues is donated. But now you break the one-for-one model because it's no longer 25 cents, which is how much it costs to buy a school meal. But we decided to go through with that, whereas we can't compromise on issues that really deal with this calorie transfer concept and dealing with both sides of the imbalance.
Yeah, I'll just add maybe an observation and the question. So in our experience over the past maybe 7-8 years with the incubator of social enterprises and looking at Ashoka in Egypt and across the Arab region and working with several other countries across the region, there is something that's always been very confusing for me. I look at East Africa, I look at India, and there are some social enterprises that are working with the bottom of the pyramid, basically. In the MENA region, you find a very interesting phenomena is that the only sector, and I would argue for that the only sector that treats the poor as clients is the microfinance industry across the region. I haven't yet met any social entrepreneur from across the region who works with the poor as clients. And this has been the struggle of Acumen, of Richard Chandler, impact investors, looking in Egypt, the most vibrant social entrepreneurship country because of the population size and everything, struggling to find bottom of the pyramid social enterprises that are working with the poor as clients, providing electricity, education, health, whatever. So some of them, even like Richard Chandler, are now in the process of setting up their own low-cost health clinics in some villages and discussing that possibility because they couldn't find what they found in Hyderabad with the Rumi schools, for example, or other models. Yeah. So that's something to think about, and I don't know if it could be a good research question, whether it's cultural, whether it's just a matter of the evolution of the sector in the region or not. The other point that I would say is that we also, back to the mission drift question, we don't want also to be replacing one donor-driven industry by another. We don't want to take out USAID and the bilaterals and multilaterals and replacement with impact investors, Acumen and the likes, because you could also be seeing that a little bit. At the developed marketplace, we're looking at social enterprises to make them investable. And investable is meaning basically that they would be sexy enough for an impact investor sitting in New York or wherever to come and invest in them. So also we have to be very aware of the fact that we're not replacing one industry with another, and again also at the expense of working with the poor, or basically being responsive to your clients versus being donor driven. I don't know if this answers the question.
Are you satisfied, Sarah Minard? Yes. Yes, you got your answer. Oh, good. You keep moving around. And there's also, I'd like to also call your attention, there's a lady on the right side, too. Okay, great. Who's our first? Yeah, thank you.
Hello. I've been following the social innovation field for some years now, and I do note a lot of the progress, and then there's a few areas that I haven't seen much that I would have expected. You know, in the progress, I mean, it's been obvious the great interest in it. You know, to see an institutional position at USAID, and New York Times is covering, you know, Tina's column, which is amazing, I think. There's at least one journal in the field that I know about. Ashoka has spurred other organizations like it in some ways. So these are great accomplishments, but there's at least 4 areas I could think of, if not more, that I would have expected more progress. And some of them are late to this panel, which is why I waited this long. But some of them could be for anything. One is there's these other terms floating around that seem to me very, very similar to social entrepreneurship or social innovators. They haven't really linked up with it yet. One is this idea of being a positive deviant, and another, probably less well known, is be called an edge walker. So I'm kind of wondering what are the pros and cons, but that's not the biggie of the 4. Another idea, and this got into it a little bit, I would have expected that there'd be more connection, more synergy between the idea of being a social entrepreneur and the corporate social responsibility field, the triple bottom line oriented business, which I tend to follow a lot and are doing some very interesting things these days, but I don't see the overlap yet. Thirdly, this is a partially philosophical issue. You know, the lunchtime speaker spoke about the importance of being a rebel, going against the norm. I think for the individual or the organization, it's impossible to follow that advice all the time. One cannot be rebellious in everything. I mean, when you go home for Thanksgiving and your mother says tone it down or something, you're probably going to do it. You know, things like real life things like that, or with say a social entrepreneuring organization that it wasn't Ashoka, but it was another one, was talking about its hiring practices and emphasized they look for people with charisma. And I remember thinking, what's so different about that? That's what the real world, that's what the bureaucratic world does. They look for people with charisma. So why are they forgetting to be innovative when it comes to their hiring practices? But the point is, you've got to be non-innovative some of the time, but I think you need to reflect when and where. And I don't really see a lot of thought in this area. And the one that I hope you will focus on, I was at the Rio Plus 10 conference in South Africa, and one of the themes, I mean, there was good news and bad news, but one of the themes from the business perspective is that all businesses need to be working towards becoming green. Not just green businesses, all businesses. And that message has kind of gotten lost. I would have expected it would happen here.
Sorry, can I interject? This is a very innovative question in that it feels almost like it's a statement. Was there a question? I mean, I'm happy to hear your views. I just wasn't sure if there was a question.
I'll get to it now.
Okay.
I would have thought there'd be more progress, particularly in the social entrepreneuring field, where I know green stuff comes up from time to time, but I would have expected it to come up all the time, but I don't see it yet. So my question is why?
Okay, well, we did hear from Mondragon already about some of your green initiatives. Did anybody want to tackle that, or should we move on to another question? I mean, I think answering questions is optional. You don't have to if you don't. You want something to say?
Yeah.
Great. Go for
no,
it.
I've just it's an excellent question, and your point also about the corporate social responsibility and the social entrepreneurship and the lack of convergence, maybe, or that it's happening but slowly a little bit, and especially in I would say in the Middle East, North Africa, it's happening even in a slower pace. When we were looking at some of the models of what's happening and how to make this more sustainable rather than just a one-time grant versus a more of an organic partnership and so on. In terms of the green, there is an increase in some solar energy and some green businesses in the region as well, I would say, in the Middle East and North Africa. And that's a big part of what we're trying to support in the development marketplace, is we're trying to look at those, some of these agricultural innovations and also programs that are based on rural, in rural development, trying to use solar energy and try to find innovative ways for alternative energies.
Thank you very much. Anybody else want to talk about green? Or do you feel? No? Maybe, Michael, have you said all you had to say? Or
Yeah, I was
do you
just
have
thinking
more
whether I
to
can
add?
add anything to this.
More to add to it?
I'm a big supporter of not just green, but sustainability. And I'm a firm believer in that medium, if not even short term, the majority of all sectors need to become more sustainable without any doubt on several layers and levels. There's, for instance, a really good example is Puma. Puma basically recently was the very first corporation that came up with an environmental profit and loss account. So what they did is they basically measured not just at the first layer, at the Puma layer, the impact on the environment, but they went down to the supplier level basically. So from the very beginning of a product, they measured all types of environmental impact and quantified them. So this is amazing, and they're leading the market in that kind of aspect. And I think it's going to be something that especially the bigger corporations will have to do if they don't want to miss that particular opportunity.
Thank you. Good. Thank you very much. And who else wants to ask a question? Oh, great.
Hi, my question is regarding the ecosystems markets. I know when you come to a corporate and then you have to reduce your carbon footprint, still you have to make business, so still you have to pollute. But I don't know, I thought like maybe 2 years ago we were like way much more ahead regarding like if it's possible to pay for water shared services, if it's possible to pay for forest services. But it seems like, I don't know, like it seems like we just got frozen and we haven't moved from there. And I really want to know what's your opinion regarding that. Do you think that is some point going to crystallize, or you think we're still like really far behind to being able to pay for that and make sure that the environment is preserved by paying for it?
Anybody want to take?
Well,
Okay, thank you.
I think it's a question of where the market is. There's so many different types of environmental services that can be valued, that have to be valued. Forests, water, anything really. But the question is, who pays for that? That is exactly the question. So unless there's regulation in place, then the only incentive for a company is if either it gives them a competitive edge or if they can save money. These are the only two incentives. Otherwise, CSR and green image, it's just an additional benefit, but it's not something that is close enough to financial metrics. So what we're faced with, for instance, is if we suggest, like for instance, energy efficiency measures, especially in Spain, then the first question is, okay, what's the kind of payback? If it's more than 2 years, sorry, don't have time for this. I'm struggling to survive, can't do this. In the context of, for instance, ecosystem services evaluation or forestry, RED Plus, it all depends on regulation. If there's no regulation in place, very difficult. Then everything is voluntary.
Thank you. What about the
I'm just going to jump in here because your regulation came up first. EHAB talked about it. It's in EHAB's report, by the way, which is amazing if anyone wants to read it. And a fantastic report on social entrepreneurship in the Middle East. And I think it's interesting to think about the comment that you also made of impact investing and how it shouldn't replace sort of development donor-driven development models or social enterprise models, right? And also, as Antara mentioned, this important way of redoing our metrics, or at least measuring what counts, or at least measuring our values and our ethics. So these are all connected because we think about you need legal frameworks in order to embed values into models where the market will respond to it naturally, but you also need regulations from the government side to punish carrot-stick approach to encourage regulators or people to invest in R&D and also to account for their footprint, right? And yet we have Fumi, who as a social entrepreneur in the United States, but also a nonprofit model in Japan, is on maybe the edge walker that the gentleman was mentioning, where there may not be a model that fits yet. You know, there may not be a legal framework that fits yet. You may be a benefit corporation, but you may not be. Benefit corporation being the fantastic new framework that we have in the United States, which if we could replicate it around the world, who knows what benefit that would have, right? So I guess one of the takeaways, and I'd love your thoughts on this as young, really representing when we talk looking to the future, it's you guys who are going to be the ones to decide at what point we just go ahead and try to harness markets without legal frameworks, at what point legal frameworks really are important to fight for in order to open up the space. And we're impact investors, keeping in mind from my definition of impact investor, I include everybody from Carl from the Rockefeller Foundation all the way to the venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. So for me, an impact investor is that whole spectrum. Where do impact investors fall into that? I mean, if you guys had the opportunity to, example, ask an impact investor, anybody on that spectrum, to come in and support your work, where would you want their investment to go? Would you want it to go into enlarging the enabling environment with legal frameworks? Would you want them to just be really investing in your bottom line or in infrastructure? Just a question. I'm interested in having your views on that.
Thank you. Great.
So I think as I was trying to say earlier, the three key areas, again, the same report that you were referring to, I would say we need to go the three of them in parallel. It would be the regulatory as well as the building up intermediaries and networks that are needed, and which is related to the regulatory framework. So, for example, when you look at the Doing Business, for example, report that comes out from the International Finance Corporation, and how in a couple of years ago, before the revolution, Egypt was 2 years consecutively listed as the #1 reformer of business environment, because of all the doing business was much easier, much less steps, less red tape, and so on. But when you look at the NGO law, which was becoming much more restrictive, for example, it's interesting that such a report does not look at these regulations, because these regulations affect social entrepreneurship, affect business, and so on. Because when you come to set up an angel investment network, or when you come to set up an incubator, when you come to set up whatever, you might sometimes want to set it up as an NGO. And this was the case in our case when we set up the NGO for the incubator, because that was the only option we had, but it was very restrictive and so on. So I would go for the regulatory framework as the #1, because it does interact with all other aspects. It interacts not only with setting up intermediaries, improving the space for financing and so on, and also I would end by saying it also affects. I would not only stop there at the capital market and providing options for B corporations or limited liability, low profitability corporations and so on throughout the world where these do not exist in some regions, but I would go as far as going to also the regulatory framework of education. how do you build service learning programs that encourage young people to go out and build not only business skills, but also understanding of their communities, so that you can be nourishing social entrepreneurs from the young people who are rooted in the reality of their communities and so on. Incentives, institutional incentives for those people to go out and have for credit, go and serve the community and so on. Many of which are lacking also, at least all across the Middle East for now.
Yes, please. Thank you, Antar.
Okay, so I'm going to speak to the two themes that you raised, the legal I mean, I know they're connected, but I'm going to speak to them separately, the legal frameworks question and the investment question, and tell me if I'm answering your question or completely going off on a tangent. As someone who's meant to be a lawyer and a legal theorist, this is going to sound, somewhat ironic, but I think that the question of formal law enters the fray quite late in the picture, as far as I'm concerned, and I think that that's a good thing, and I think that that's how it needs to be. To me, the reason why I started to study microfinance in the first place as an institutional theorist is that it was really remarkable institutional innovation as I saw it, because it was this island of sudden institutional functionality in a very, very institutionally dysfunctional space. I mean, by and large, legal frameworks, laws, regulatory frameworks, except at the macro level, don't have much traction in the developing world. And I think that microfinance is really interesting as an institutional case study because it eked out the space for itself. It wasn't really noticed, and then it grew and grew and grew, both at a macro level institutional structure, but in terms of its borrowers and their sort of the norm frames in which they were operating. And in Bangladesh sort of grew into a moment where regulation and the formal structures supported it. And to me, that seems a much more effective and natural process of evolution than starting the other way around. I've done some work on the land titling program in Peru, which attempts to go the other way. It attempts to set the structures in place first and then embed it in the social, in the social context. But that's one of hundreds of thousands of formalistic reform efforts that have failed. And so there is room for a regulatory framework and formal law, and I think that's important at some stage, but it's sort of a later consideration, as far as I'm concerned. About the issue of sort of investing in impact investors, a large part of the reason, or at least one of the main reasons why SKS was able to generate the amount of funding that it was that there was there were rules requiring commercial banks to lend a certain, a portion of their sort of allocation had to be to certain kinds of sectors. And this was, as we clearly saw, this was a disastrous experiment. And so we've been talking about donor funding and sort of sort of private funding. But there is a middle ground, and the route that Grameen went down is that it essentially for many years now it's been funding itself out of deposits from borrowers. And so I think there are ways of, I think there's something to be said for the social sector to remain in some senses distinct from the private and the public sectors. And I think if one is imaginative, there are ways, as you were talking about how microfinances use the poor as clients. There are, not in a sort of extractive sense, hopefully, but developed that kind of a market relationship with the poor. I think there are ways of imagining and creating other sources of funding that I think are worth investing more of our sort of energies in.
Good. Yes. Question? Do we have a mic? I think maybe one more, and then we'll wrap up.
So I'm interested in hearing about leveraging and really mobilizing all of the resources. Many of us in the room, if not all of us, would like to see those who have less, those who are less privileged, those who are disenfranchised, have access, have capacity. But the challenge is often mobilizing resources in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, and doing that in a way that's effective, in a way that really multiplies the effect. Not to overuse a term, but so I'd like to ask, what are some ways that you're either aware of or have utilized that social entrepreneurs and or nonprofits have engaged corporations in particular in more than just a clientelistic kind of a way where they're looking at corporations as just funders for their social projects and looking at them as partners and really trying to engage the private sector in the mission, in the social mission. You know, we were kind of talking about this earlier, started to get into this in our group discussion at the World Cafe. Are you seeing examples, or do you represent examples of truly mobilizing the private sector in ways that enhance the service provision, aside from just volunteer hours and money being donated?
I'm not sure if this answers your question, but when I saw harnessing markets for social change, for me, and you know, it's going to go back to what we do at Table for Two, but for me, it means that you know, each party, there has to be something in it for each party, and so. You know, when we pitch to restaurants or universities or corporations, we have a different pitch that targets their specific needs. And for corporations, it's CSR, but it's more than that. And you know, this is on a very micro scale with one particular organization, but we really think that there's value that we can add to a corporation by partnering with them. And that's, you know, if a corporation donates, say, $5 million to a charity, they might write about it in their annual report. They might issue a press release, but that's it. There's no engagement after that. And I think that, you know, for example, with our model, by going into their cafeterias, their employees, you know, see the posters and see the table tents like that every day. And there's a lot more connection between the employees and the employer and what kinds of initiatives they're involved in. So at a very, very micro scale, that's the experience from Table for Two.
Any other panelists wanting to add? I know we're running out of time here. Sure. Yeah, please.
I feel that I've been jumping into every question.
We love
so sorry
it.
if
That's what you're here for.
I have
Thank
something to say, but not sometimes not very. Just a very quick question. I think in the Middle East, North Africa, and Egypt in particular, where you have maybe one of the most evolved corporate sectors and a lot of multinationals and so on, and a very vibrant NGO sector despite the legal and regulatory restrictions and so on. I think we're in a very nascent stage. It's still a very transactional kind of relationship, but you see some evolution, and I think it's a matter of time that this is going to start happening. You find in some of the projects that we are incubating, for example, like the career development centers, some are finding corporate sponsors that have maybe sponsored an event or a career fair, but have then decided to become more engaged in developing some of the programs, or asking the career development office to help them develop a certain skill-based program for their employees and so on. So you're finding this happening, I would say, slowly. There have been some also partnerships between NGOs like Care International and others in Egypt, with Heinz, for example, where the NGO works with tomato growers and enters with Heinz into an agreement where they become part of their value chain and their supply chain. So it becomes a win-win, and it's not only just a transactional. But I would say we're very far away from having but I think it's a matter of time. Hopefully it's evolving towards that direction.
Good. I think we have time for one last super quick question and a super quick answer. Would anybody like to rise to the challenge? Yes.
What role do you see for citizen engagement? Because it seems to me that a good part of harnessing markets is about creating transparency, and even though markets generate often very good results, they often also generate very bad results. And as an alternative to regulation, I think you need to bring citizens into the picture. How do you see that?
For anyone who didn't hear, citizen engagement, what role does that have to play? that has Antara's name written all over it, that question?
Well, to begin with, in the case of microfinance, the answer sort of suggests itself in that the 25 to 30 odd million borrowers of microfinance are citizens themselves, and so citizens are being engaged in a very active sort of way. And you know, the estimate for microfinance borrowers across the world is, I mean, it ranges between 50 million and 1 billion. And so this is, and the appeal for microfinance, as far as I'm concerned, is that it's fundamentally a bottom-up process and doesn't sort of infantilize the participants, but they're sort of active agents. And it sort of augments their sort of their existence as citizens in a more holistic way, in that the structures are participatory. And one of the great triumphs of Grameen in Bangladesh is that a lot of Grameen members have contested local elections, and so I'm taking sort of citizens, interpreting it in a different light, but in a very real way, it is participatory, not only for the agents, but I think that as the sort of prestige of the sector grows, and in Bangladesh it's a relatively sort of high prestige sector to be involved in. I mean, more and more people are attracted to sort of working for these organizations and so on. So, I mean, I think sort of citizen engagement is a huge part of this phenomenon. If you're talking about just sort of third parties that are not involved in any active capacity, microfinance doesn't do that much, but I think that may be not a bad thing, because I think moving away from the donor model has been a good thing for it. So.
Good, thank you. All right, well, I think on that note, we will wrap up what's been a fascinating and fantastic day with a huge number of interesting panels, and I think we're getting closing remarks from someone who's not me. So let's just thank the panelists.
Thank you, Anya, so much. That was really exciting and interesting, and just such a diverse historical and also very present and futuristic view of the world. So thank you for that. And we're going to have closing remarks from the EPD director, Jose Antonio Ocampo.
Well, let me really say that I have been coming and leaving all the time because of my other tasks these days. But it has really been really enjoyable to listen to the discussions. As I said the first time, Sarah invited me to one of the panels last year. On this issue, which I have not been familiar with, except on the sites, and trying to understand what this is, and I think it comes clearly from the discussions that that one thing that is very characteristic of this is the fact that is solidarity in different forms. Let's say that's why actually in my United Nations Day. I had an idea of doing something with the ILO, which is, of course, in the UN system in charge of the cooperative system, of doing something that we broadly call the social economy. All the forms of solidarity that subsist despite the proliferation of markets, and actually may proliferate and tend to proliferate the most, I think, when when the states don't work well, or when there is a rejection to the role of the state. For instance, like in this country, I was struck one day. I was in the World Economic Forum headquarters in Geneva, and talking about something else, and I leaving, and I saw this stand of talking about the price on social enterprise that they have. And I said, well, what is this? I didn't know. I had never heard the term. So it was interesting. I said, well, and then I started talking. I said, where is this important? And they said, it's actually where the state doesn't quite play its role. So that when the state has, a significant provision of services, for example, or gives opportunities to people. You know, the state actually plays that role, and they're very limited social enterprise. So it's typical more of society because, you know, that they don't have, or economies, let's say, and society that don't have, you know, enough of a state or reject the state for some societal reasons, let's say. But you know, the element of solidarity is, I find it, you know, very across the different presentations. But the second, I think, the interesting thing is the mix with leadership, organizational skills, that's entrepreneurship, and technology. Let's say that characterizes, and you know, with, you know, I guess the issue of technology becoming, you know, very important. And the third feature that I was very struck in different presentations is internationalization, so that, you know, globalization has also hit this sector, let's say. And there are many initiatives, and the successful initiatives are spreading to other countries, which is actually a very interesting feature, which was certainly not true in the past, let's say, of the forms of solidarity, such as the cooperative movement, let's say, which is probably the oldest forms of solidarity. And the fourth that is quite clear is diversity, and I think probably, I guess, for you who work in this field, I think it's good to try to come up with a clear domain on which you know, you want to use these concepts, because it looks to me also like I was actually in the UN the other day talking about a report on innovative sources of financing. Okay, so innovative, you know, the word, which is of course a very a good word. And I said, well, you know, what are the innovative sources of financing? And again, people are putting into that basket more things that probably belong. And I'm afraid that in some cases, I think you have to limit the basket to, you know, what it should contain. And finally, let me just put, let's say, a gray area which I found, which is what is the role of policy? So if governments want to promote, I mean, I heard some views here that, you know, just governments should get out of this, you know, should not trend. But then, you know, if governments get out, there is no role for policy. You know, so what is the role for policy? You know, in what cases can the state be useful or and used? Because this is in a sense, the forms, you know. I mean, this recognizes that aside from markets and state, there is society. You know, I said there's a sort of a triangle, and more discussions refer to markets and states, but forget. And I think this is about the third part of the triangle, which is society, and how society actually organizes itself sometimes by itself, let's say. But the question is, under what conditions would the state play a useful role? Okay, so those are my just free thoughts. And let me, of course, thank the many people that have contributed to this event. And I should really start again with Sarah Minar and Jenny McGill, which have been at the center of this effort for a year, since I was one of the happy persons who approved this project in the committee of that we have to allocate our very scarce resources for this sort of activity. So I think they have been playing a very useful role. And then, of course, we have Anya Shrifin, who became our partner, Patty, Michael, and Scott Martin. From the student side, thank Anna Korduski, Francisco Noguera, Catarina Spinel, Vladimir Olarte, and Matt Cruz. I think they have really played a very good role in spreading the word and helping very much in the organization. A big thank also to our own EPD concentration manager, Ilona Winklerova, who actually managed a lot of the administrative work for this and invitations, etc., etc. As I said here, make sure that all the T's were crossed and all the I's dotted. Okay, I think that's a good description of them. And a special thanks also to the student groups that co-sponsored the event today. They are the New Media Task Force, Colombia's Impact Investment Initiative, and SIPA Net Impact. And also thank Micaela Ordal, who is our building manager, for working with us on this innovative layout that you have been enjoying today. Jesse Gale, Phoebe Ford in SIPA's Communication and External Relations Office, and Frank Rapkiewicz, SIPA's Systems Manager. So with that, let me invite you to the, the food and drinks, and also to the virtual tour of the social innovations that we'll have in a few minutes.